Now, at this point and some other points, I may get into some things that escape you momentarily or go right by you, but I would urge you to follow through. You can look them up in popular accounts. Check your encyclopedia under references such as logic, or maybe some of you are studying logic, and you'll see some of the directions that I'm going in here. Any theory, so we speak about verification, any theory is not infinitely defendable. You cannot keep saying because this, and keep this up forever. Theories are based on assumptions, and one does not prove an assumption, but starts from the point of an assumption. The Muslim's first assumption is simply this: the universe makes sense. And this is the same as the modern scientific assumption. Where scientific disciplines overlap, they have to be consistent. If you have a theory of chemistry and you have a theory of biology, at certain points they overlap. Chemistry is applied to biology and so on. Where they overlap, the two theories that describe both of them can't give an inconsistency. So there must be a bigger theory which takes them all in. And this is the way the scientist reasons, that if he has a consistent theory, he believes it's not going to conflict if it overlaps with somebody else's theory, as long as it's consistent also. The alternative to that assumption, the assumption that the universe makes sense, is chaos. It means that one mistrusts everything. If a person says, no, the universe doesn't make any sense, a man is really saying, I can't be certain of anything. So we want to ask that man, can you be certain of that? You see the trap he's in? If a man wants to mistrust everything, then he has to mistrust his mistrust. And he's paralyzed. He doesn't make any progress. So the first assumption seems to be an option that doesn't really have an alternative. So it's not really an option. Interestingly enough, two of the attributes of God, as described in the Quran, are always put together. Al-Wahid al-Qahar, the one, the compelling, or the irresistible. This assumption that the universe makes sense is really the same as the foundation of Islam. La ilaha illallah. There is no God but the God. Ilah is translated God. And La ilaha illallah is saying there is but the one Ilah. If God is a difficult term for people because of its connotations, translate Ilah however you will. Ilah is that which ultimately influences events. It is the most basic and the universal constraint. The assumption of consistency is a constraint. It's a restriction. Just as the principle of the conservation of matter and energy is a restriction. There's no proof of it. But it is an assumption and a restriction made on all physical observations. The belief of the physical scientist. La ilaha illallah says of this ultimate reality that there is one such reality and there is only one such reality. We assume the principle of at least one when we say the universe makes sense, and then we realize that, well, if there was more than one, the universe wouldn't make sense either, because overlapping theories would be inconsistent if they were under different initial constraints. Suppose some scientists believed in magic and in whimsical gods that acted however the mood would strike them, so that today you combine hydrogen and oxygen and you get water, but tomorrow you mix hydrogen and oxygen and you get peanuts. Would a scientist who expected the universe to function that way make any kind of progress? Could he be successful? As the Quran says of believers, they are the successful, muflihun. The punishment of polytheists, those who believe in many gods, is expected by Muslims not because there is a jealous God who takes the insult very personally and he'll get you for it. The punishment is expected because it's still another example of being punished by your sins, not for your sins. A man does strange things to his mind when he believes in many gods. He hurts himself. We deal with life according to what we've been convinced of, and life leads to death. We have to live with that knowledge. And what happens to the ego, the consciousness, the intellect, me inside? What happens in dying? It must depend on what has gone before, whatever that experience is like. Is it frightening or is it peaceful? When senses are cut off and mental activity has a final burst, and there can be no doubt that it does. Now we're talking about electrodynamics and collapsing electrical fields. There is a burst as the brain dies. What's it like? I won't speculate, but we do know that false hopes will be dashed. If one believed without justification that there existed a God who treated us in such and such a way according to what we believed and how we behaved, one is due for disappointment in the extreme if he were misinformed or misdirected. Now to the second point, as I said, man is lost except for those who believe and do good. Amalu salihat. The root meaning of the word salahah indicates really being useful. And this should be an obvious prerequisite to avoid being lost. To say that a man is not useful is to say that he has not realized his potential. Unless you do what you are capable of, you've lost something of your humanity. And the finish of your human life is going to be something less than the finish of another human life, another human who made more of his human life. Albert Schweitzer said that he found God within himself as the stirring of ethical will. In other words, he knew what he could do, and he did it. He left behind him the comfort and the riches and the fame that was a sure thing in Europe when he was a young man. He left that behind him and he moved to a leper colony in Africa, where he continued to study and write and help the lepers, and he lived into his 90s. He realized his potential. Now, psychologists could tell us, no doubt, plenty about those who think they are happy, they're comfortable, but they face anguish from inside themselves. What kind of shape is their intellect taking under this kind of torture? People who have convinced themselves they're happy, and they're not really. They are doing less than they could have done. What's it doing to their minds? As to those who make the most of their abilities, here is how God acts in the world. He acts indirectly. The Quran talks about taqwa, usually translated as God consciousness. A man with taqwa has his mind on the absolute as a reference point. His mind is not fixed on what is relative. He's not worried about money or clothing or various other things that depend on other things themselves. His mind is fixed as a reference point on what depends on nothing, the absolute. And then God moves people. Not like we move a checker on a board, like that, but he moves people the way that the goal at the end of the soccer field moves the soccer team. That team will battle away. Does the goal reach out and pull them this way? No, but it's out there. And by keeping an eye on that, that's where they're heading. Indirectly, they are moved by that goal. And here's where we are led to deal with another concept of God, another item in belief. Common practice divides reality into the natural and the supernatural. And occasionally God is thought to interfere with the natural order, reaching down from the supernatural, and he works a miracle. This kind of miracle is really a monster. It's not the same kind of a miracle as the miracle of a beautiful sunrise, or the miracle that a spot as small as a speck of dust can grow into a human being. That's a miracle. But this miracle that interferes with the natural order, that's a whole different thing that people are thinking of. To me, it's a monster.